long time ago, economics was a story about people. There were bakers, butchers, barbers, fear, hope, and ambition. People, as always, made mistakes, panicked, and copied one another. When Adam Smith wrote about incentives, he also wrote about morality. Veblen mocked the status games of the wealthy. Keynes, meanwhile, saw economics almost entirely as psychology. Uncertainty, panic, and what he called animal spirits were at its very core. Economics was messy. It was argumentative, sometimes inconsistent, even unsettled. But it looked like life. Then something happened. By the middle of the 20th century, the language of economics had completely changed. Stories gave way to graphs. People turned into equations. Hypotheses stopped being debated and began to be presented almost like laws of nature. Economics was no longer a field concerned with morality, power, and human weakness. It now spoke like a neutral, cool-headed scientific discipline. This shift did not happen by accident, and behind it stood a single name: Paul Samuelson. But to understand Samuelson, you first have to understand the world he entered. The early 20th century was an embarrassing period for economists. Classical theory promised that markets would correct themselves. Everyone was rational. The system was stable. Then the Great Depression arrived. Millions lost their jobs, banks collapsed, production stalled, and economics could not explain what was happening. Keynes stepped into this void and said what no one wanted to hear or accept. Markets sometimes spiral out of control. People panic. Chaos emerges, and the state must intervene. These ideas worked, but they were uncomfortable because they were intuitive, human, and they did not look like science. After the war, however, a different need emerged. States had grown larger. Central banks had become powerful. Decisions had to be made, but they needed to appear technical and unavoidable. Economics could no longer be a debate. It had to become an engineering problem. This is where Samuelson entered the picture. He was not a revolutionary. He never wanted to tear the system down. On the contrary, he wanted to give it a solid skeleton. He loved mathematics. He was fascinated by physics. And he asked a simple question: if physics can explain the universe with equations, why can't economics explain markets the same way? His 1947 book, Foundations of Economic Analysis, was exactly that. Not a book of opinions, but an architectural blueprint, an attempt to present economics through a single unified logic. The basic assumptions were simple. People maximize utility, firms pursue profit, markets coordinate these decisions. Samuelson was not saying this is how people truly behave. He was saying if we assume this, the models work. And they really did. Economics suddenly became clean, structured, predictable. It was presented like a machine, something that could be examined, adjusted, and programmed. Along with mathematics borrowed from physics came a confidence borrowed from physics as well. Samuelson's greatest achievement was bringing Keynesian ideas together with classical economics. He neither discarded free markets nor placed the state at the center. Instead, he said, markets usually work, but sometimes they break down. When they do, the state steps in, and once things stabilize, it steps back. This story suited everyone, and through Samuelson's textbook, it spread across the world. Economics was taught for generations. It trained central bankers, bureaucrats, academics, and traders. It didn't just teach economics, it defined what economics was. And that is where the real problem began. Once an idea enters the curriculum, it often stops being questioned. Assumptions become invisible. Alternatives are no longer seen as wrong, but as unserious. Economics gained power. It gained prestige. It became the language of policy, but there was a cost. Human behavior was simplified. Power relations were pushed aside. Psychology was treated as noise. Crises were described not as features of the system, but as exceptions. Economics stopped speaking to people and started speaking about them. Samuelson did not intend this. He genuinely cared about human welfare, but the system he built gradually became a discipline that trusted its models more than the people within them. As economics gained authority, it also created distance. And that distance is still felt today. Models became shields for decision makers. Not, this is what we chose, but this is what the model says. Political options were presented as technical necessities. Power hid behind mathematics. This approach worked well in calm periods. Inflation was controlled. Growth was forecast. The system appeared manageable. But the system never stopped being human. Bubbles, panics, and collapses were still there. They just had no place in the models. What happened was labeled abnormal. Risks were underestimated. Leverage became invisible. And when confidence collapsed, equations lagged behind reality. The 2008 crisis exposed this contradiction brutally. The models were perfect until they weren't. The problem wasn't a lack of intelligence, it was excessive confidence. And even after the crisis, the same framework remained. Extraordinary measures were called temporary and became permanent. Emergency became the new normal. That is why Samuelson's legacy is so complicated. On one hand, without modern economics, the crisis would have been far more destructive. Institutions needed a language, a structure. On the other hand, that same language pushed people even further away from the system. Inflation, inequality, and asset bubbles were no longer experienced as misfortunes, but as proof that the system worked for someone else. The irony is this: Samuelson knew this. He warned that models were simplifications. He said they should not be taken too literally. But once a framework becomes institutionalized, warnings fade. What remains is certainty. Keynes's humility disappears. Veblen's critique of power fades. Adam Smith's moral concerns are forgotten. The center of gravity in economics shifts. That is why today, when economics is discussed, many people feel excluded. The problem is not ignorance, the problem is a system that rewards certainty over empathy. The solution is not to throw modern economics away. The solution is to remember what it is. Models are not reality, they are maps. Samuelson gave us a very detailed map, but no map can show every street, every obstacle, every human reaction. When you start mistaking the map for reality, you stop navigating and start imposing. Understanding Samuelson helps explain why today's economy feels powerful, rigid, cold, and fragile all at once. It explains why policies sound confident, right up until they no longer can. That tension is still with us. And overcoming it does not mean rejecting expertise. It means learning not to confuse certainty with wisdom.